The night had fallen with a coldness that seemed to seep right into your bones. I had just returned from a trip to the mountains, a place that was meant to be a getaway, to escape the suffocating routine of daily life. But it didn't turn out that way. Instead, I found myself in the midst of something I could never explain, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a cabin tucked away in the woods of Colorado, just me and a few friends. We had rented the place through a website, and honestly, it seemed like the perfect escape from the city. The snow had started to fall as we drove up, thick flakes swirling around us like a white mist. It was beautiful, picturesque even, the kind of scene you'd see on a postcard. But it wasn't long before things started to feel off. The moment we stepped into the cabin, there was this heavy feeling in the air. It wasn't cold. No, the heating was working fine, but the atmosphere felt thick, almost suffocating, like something was just watching us. The first night was fine. We drank, laughed, told ghost stories by the fire, as you do in a cabin surrounded by snow and silence. But that night, something strange happened. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside. I could hear it rattling against the windows, but it wasn't that which had woken me up. It was something else. A faint creaking noise. It wasn't the house settling. No, this was something else. Like footsteps on the wooden floor above me. I laid there, frozen, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around the upstairs. But no one was supposed to be up there. We had the entire place to ourselves, and I was sure no one else was around. At first, I thought maybe it was one of my friends messing with me. So I waited. I waited for it to stop, for someone to come down and laugh, telling me it was just a prank. But it didn't stop. The creaking continued, moving from one side of the house to the other. And then I heard a door slowly creak open, followed by silence. I got up, grabbing my phone and shining the light across the room. I didn't want to turn on the main lights. Something in my gut told me not to. I tiptoed over to the stairs, heart racing, and slowly started to climb them. The creaking seemed to get louder, more pronounced, like whatever was up there was coming closer. By the time I reached the top, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down the dark hallway. The door to the master bedroom was wide open, the light from the moon shining through the window. But there was no sign of anyone. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Every instinct told me to turn back, but something was pulling me forward. As I passed each door, I noticed they were all open. All except one. The door at the very end of the hall was shut tight. And that's when I noticed something strange. The air felt colder, and there was an odd, musty smell coming from behind the door. A smell like something forgotten, something left to rot. I didn't want to open it. I should have turned back, but curiosity got the best of me. I slowly reached for the handle, and as my fingers brushed against it, the door creaked open on its own, like it had been waiting for me. The room inside was dark, save for a small crack of light filtering in through a boarded-up window. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. A large, dusty mirror mounted on the wall. The kind of antique mirror you only find in old, forgotten houses. But there was something strange about this one. The reflection didn't match the room. Instead of the bare, empty room I was standing in, the reflection showed a completely different scene. The room in the mirror was lit by a soft, eerie glow. There was a chair in the center, a rocking chair that gently swayed back and forth, as though someone had just left it. But no one was there. In the reflection, I saw the walls lined with old, faded pictures, their faces blurred and distorted. But one picture stood out, an old family photo with a woman standing in front of a cabin, her face pale and twisted in a grotesque smile. I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see something move in the corner of my eye. But the room was still empty, still dark. I looked back into the mirror. That's when I saw her. A woman standing behind me, just over my shoulder, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. She was wearing an old, tattered dress, the fabric torn at the edges, and her skin looked pale, almost sickly. I could see her mouth move as if she was whispering something, but I couldn't hear her. I spun around, heart thumping, but there was no one there. Panic gripped me as I backed away from the mirror, stumbling over my own feet. I felt the cold air surrounding me, seeping into my skin, and I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there. I had to. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, coming from behind me. Leave. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floorboards, my breath shallow and ragged. I didn't stop until I reached the stairs and nearly fell down them in my haste to escape. I burst into the living room where my friends were sleeping soundly, oblivious to what had just happened. I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Who would believe me? What would they think of me? The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the corner of my vision. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside had me on edge. I didn't sleep. Not really. I couldn't. On the drive back, I tried to shake off the fear, but it clung to me like a shadow that refused to leave. And when I finally got home, I thought it would end, that maybe it had just been a bad dream. But then I looked in the mirror. It wasn't the same mirror from the cabin, but it didn't matter. The reflection wasn't right. My face, my eyes were different. There was something behind me, something in the reflection, just out of sight. I couldn't see it directly, but I knew it was there. I've been haunted ever since. I hear the footsteps sometimes, feel the cold air brushing against my neck, and I swear I see her in the corner of my vision, always watching, always waiting. And every winter, when the snow begins to fall, I can't help but feel that same suffocating chill. It's not just the cold, though, it's something else, something darker, something that follows me, and it's not leaving. Not anytime soon.
Next story.
It was the winter of 2013 when I first moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. I had always dreamed of owning a house like this, big, old, with a lot of character. This one was perfect, tucked away at the edge of the woods with towering trees that seemed to watch over it like guardians. The realtor had mentioned that it had been on the market for a while, but I didn't think anything of it. The price was right, and I was eager to start a new chapter in my life. The house itself was stunning. 3 stories tall, with intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and an impressive staircase that led to the second floor. The floors creaked under my feet, but that only added to the charm. I spent the first few days unpacking, organizing, and getting acquainted with the space. It was peaceful, quiet, too quiet almost, but I loved it. I thought I'd finally found my sanctuary. But then, on the 4th night, things changed. It started as a flicker. A light in the hallway just outside my bedroom door dimmed and brightened, then went out entirely. I got up, annoyed, thinking it was just an old bulb that needed replacing. As I walked into the hallway, I could hear soft footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze. No one else was in the house. I was certain of that. I had locked every door, checked every window, but still, the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling. That old creaky wood was bound to make noises. But the more I listened, the more I realized something wasn't right. The footsteps weren't coming from the floors or the walls, they were coming from above, from the attic. I tried to ignore it, but that night, sleep was impossible. The sound of footsteps above me continued for hours, until finally, just before dawn, they stopped. The next day, I decided to investigate. I climbed up into the attic, flashlight in hand. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit space filled with old furniture, forgotten belongings, and boxes stacked high. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In the far corner of the attic, there was a large antique mirror covered in a thick sheet. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to uncover it. My fingers shook as I pulled the sheet off, revealing the mirror's reflective surface. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at my own reflection. It was normal, just me in a dusty old attic. But then something shifted. The reflection in the mirror didn't quite match what I was doing. I took a step back, but the figure in the mirror stayed where it was. It was me, but not me. The version of me in the mirror had a strange, twisted smile on its face. I blinked, and the reflection flickered like a malfunctioning TV screen. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. The reflection didn't respond, but its smile grew wider, more malicious. My heart began to race. I turned and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. That night, the footsteps came again. But this time, they weren't just footsteps. There was something else, an odd tapping, almost like fingernails scraping against the floor. It came from the hallway, from the door to the attic. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly got up, my feet frozen to the floor, and walked toward the door. I could feel it, the presence on the other side. There was something waiting, something in that attic. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty still. But then I heard a whisper, soft and eerie, coming from above me. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I listened, the words became clearer. Come to me. I froze, panic setting in. My body was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my coat and rushed out of the house into the cold, snowy night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest neighbor's house, breathless and terrified. The couple who lived there, the Hargraves, let me inside and offered me tea, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't form the words. The terror from the house was still gripping me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. Mrs. Hargrave must have sensed something was wrong. She looked at me with knowing eyes, her voice calm but grave. You've seen it, haven't you? She asked softly. Seen what? I managed to whisper. The mirror, she said, nodding slowly. It's not just any mirror. It's an old family heirloom, one that's been passed down for generations. And with it comes a curse. A curse, I echoed, still in disbelief. The mirror, she continued, was said to trap the soul of anyone who gazed into it too long. It doesn't just show you your reflection, it shows something darker, something that wants to take you. Once you see it, you can't escape it. Her words sent a chill down my spine. There's nothing you can do. It'll follow you until it gets what it wants, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have told you before, but now it's too late. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The image of that twisted reflection haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the smile, the way it had twisted and contorted like something out of a nightmare. The tapping grew louder, more frequent. I could hear it even when I was outside, as if it was right behind me. On the fourth night after the Hargraves' warning, I returned to the house against all rational thought. I had to see it for myself. I had to end this. I climbed back into the attic, my heart pounding with dread. The mirror was still there, standing tall in the corner, waiting. As I approached it, I could feel the air grow colder, heavier. I didn't dare look into it at first, but then the whispering started again, soft and insistent. Come to me. I took a deep breath and I looked. There, in the glass, I saw myself again. But this time I was standing there with the same twisted smile I had seen before. The smile in the reflection didn't belong to me. It was a grotesque, demonic version of myself, its eyes hollow, its smile wide and grotesque. It didn't just want me, it was me. Suddenly, the reflection reached out, its hand coming through the glass toward me. I screamed, stumbling back, but it was too late. The hand grabbed my wrist, cold as ice, and pulled me toward the mirror. I fought, struggling, but the reflection was stronger than I could ever have imagined. It was pulling me in, dragging me toward the dark, endless void within the glass. And then just before I was swallowed whole, I realized it wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal to another world, one where the reflection was real and the living were nothing but shadows. And as I was pulled through, I understood that I had become one with it. Now, every winter I hear the tapping. It's the sound of my own fingers against the glass as I wait for the next victim to stare into the mirror and become part of the curse.
Next story.
It was the winter of 2007, one of the coldest winters I can remember. I had just moved to a small house out in the middle of nowhere in the hills of West Virginia. I needed a fresh start, and this remote place seemed like the perfect retreat. The house itself wasn't much, an old two-story farmhouse that had been abandoned for years. It had the kind of creaky charm that you'd expect from something decades old, with its sagging porch and windows that rattled in the wind. I knew the house had a history. The previous owner, a man named Thomas Wainwright, had died here under mysterious circumstances. At least, that's what the locals told me. There were whispers of strange happenings before his death, but nothing specific. Some said he'd gone mad, others claimed he was haunted by something dark. I didn't believe any of it. I thought it was just small-town gossip. It was the night before Christmas when it started. The snow had begun to fall early in the evening, and by midnight, the ground was covered in a thick, suffocating blanket. I had just finished a late dinner and was settling in with a book by the fire. The wind howled outside, and the house groaned in the storm's fury. I'd grown used to the noises of the house, the creaking floorboards, the drafts through the walls, the sound of the house settling. But that night, there was something different. Around 1 a.m., I heard it, a soft scratching sound from upstairs. It was faint at first, like the scurrying of something small. I tried to ignore it, assuming it was the house again, but it grew louder. It wasn't just a scratching sound anymore. It was a thumping. Slow, deliberate, like something was walking around up there. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to remain calm. It was just the house, I told myself. Nothing more. But then, I heard it again, this time, clearer and closer, as if whatever was making the noise was now in the room just above me. I stood up from my chair, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way upstairs. The air grew colder as I climbed the stairs, the temperature dropping so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of me. When I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway was dark, so dark that the beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the thick shadows. I felt an eerie stillness in the air, like the house was holding its breath. I took a deep breath and made my way toward the door of the guest room, where the noise had been coming from. As I approached, the door creaked open on its own. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, and the wind had blown the curtains into the room. Snow had drifted in, covering the floor. I froze, my stomach dropping. I hadn't opened the window. I walked closer, shining my flashlight around the room. The air was frigid, and the snow had begun to pile up on the floor. But there was something else, something in the corner of the room that made my blood run cold. A shadow. It was tall, far too tall to be human, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like they were bending at odd angles. The shadow was still and silent, standing in the corner where the wall met the ceiling. I could feel its eyes on me, even though there were no visible features. It was as if it were watching, waiting. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering, and the shadow suddenly lunged forward. I screamed and ran down the hallway, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I reached the stairs, but as I turned to descend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The stairs themselves were warped, twisted as though they were alive. The wood groaned, bending under some unseen weight. I didn't think. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my feet slipping on the icy steps. I made it to the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, I heard a whisper in my ear, soft but unmistakable. "Leave." I whipped around, but no one was there. The house felt suffocating, closing in on me. I didn't stop to think, didn't even look back. I ran into the snowstorm, the biting cold stinging my face, the wind howling in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house, the one just down the road. I pounded on their door, gasping for air, my clothes soaked through with snow and sweat. The elderly couple who lived there, Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, let me in without a word. I collapsed on their couch, shaking, unable to speak for a while. They didn't ask any questions, just wrapped me in blankets and sat beside me as I tried to calm down. After a long while, when my mind had slowed and the panic had eased, Mrs. Fletcher spoke. "Did you see it?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. "See what?" I replied, my voice hoarse from the screaming. "The shadow," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "The one that haunts that house. It's been there for years. It's not just the house, it's the land. Thomas Wainwright didn't die by accident. He was taken." I stared at her, my heart pounding again. "Taken? By what?" "By the spirit of the land itself. It feeds on the living," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "Thomas, he went mad because of it. He thought he could escape it, but there's no escaping that curse. No one who stays in that house lives for long." I didn't know what to say. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. She continued. "People say it's the spirit of the land bound to the house. When the snow falls heavy in winter, that's when it's strongest. It waits for someone to come. Someone who doesn't know what they're walking into." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, pacing around the Fletcher's home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The shadow, the whisper, the feeling of being watched. The whole experience felt unreal, like some terrible nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose weakly over the snow-covered hills, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew I couldn't go back to that house. Not yet. I couldn't even bring myself to go back and check on my things. I left West Virginia the next day and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something far worse. But I do know this. There is something evil in those hills, something ancient and hungry, and it waits for the next person who dares to step onto its land. And now, every winter, when the snow falls and the wind howls, I hear that same scratching sound. It follows me wherever I go.
Next story.
I've always had a bit of a fascination with abandoned places, particularly old hotels. There's something eerie about them, especially when they've been left to decay. The thought of forgotten memories, abandoned luggage, and vacant rooms is enough to give anyone the chills. So when I stumbled across an old rundown hotel while hiking in the mountains, I couldn't resist checking it out. The hotel was hidden deep in the woods, far off the beaten path. It had clearly been closed for decades, the sign barely hanging on by a single rusted bolt. The windows were covered in grime, the wood on the exterior weathered and cracked. But there was something about the place that drew me in, an old charm, as if it were calling to me. It was late afternoon when I first arrived. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the crumbling structure. I could hear the faint sounds of the wind rustling through the trees, but there was something off about it. The usual sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, were strangely absent. Only the wind remained, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I pushed open the door with a creak that echoed through the empty lobby. The place smelled musty, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture, though old and worn, looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. A reception desk sat in the corner, covered in cobwebs. I wandered around the main floor, snapping pictures as I went, taking in the ghostly atmosphere of the hotel. But as I walked deeper into the building, the air seemed to grow colder. I found a set of stairs leading up to the second floor. The banister was rotting, and the wood creaked ominously beneath my feet as I ascended. The second floor was just as decrepit as the first, with more broken furniture and dust-covered mirrors. But something caught my attention as I wandered down the hallway. There was a door at the very end of the corridor, slightly ajar, and a faint light flickering from inside. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no reason to believe anyone else was in the building. After all, it had been abandoned for years, according to the local legend. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. It was different from the others. The furniture was still old, but it looked, well, used. There was a bed, though the sheets were yellowed with age, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. The most striking thing, though, was the old-fashioned lamp on the nightstand. It was still flickering, as if someone had just turned it on moments ago. I reached out and touched the lamp, wondering how it was still working in such a decaying place. But as soon as my fingers brushed the metal, the light flickered out completely, plunging the room into darkness. A chill ran down my spine. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. A soft, melodic voice, almost like a lullaby, whispering my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what to do. My instincts told me to run, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Come closer. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The room seemed to grow colder with each step I took, the air thick and suffocating. The whispering was now joined by a low, guttural sound, almost like the groan of wood or the creaking of a door, but it felt wrong, like something was moving behind me. I turned around quickly, my flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was nothing except the feeling of being watched. The room was still, silent, save for the heavy breathing that was now filling my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just behind me, waiting. I saw it. In the mirror on the dresser, a figure appeared. At first, it's just a shadow, but slowly it became clearer. A woman, standing just behind me, her face obscured by a veil of long, dark hair. Her dress was tattered, as if it had been worn for years, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. But what struck me the most were her eyes, wide and hollow, empty pits that seemed to stare straight into my soul. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with that lifeless gaze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted for the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. But just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping, and the room was suddenly dark again. The lamp had gone out. The whispering was gone, replaced by an unbearable silence. The door wouldn't budge. I tried pushing it, pulling it, but it was stuck. My hands were slick with sweat as I scrambled to free myself. The air grew heavier, the walls seeming to close in around me. I could feel the temperature dropping rapidly, my breath forming mist in the air. And that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, heavy and dragging. I turned around, but the woman wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was only darkness. And in the darkness, I could feel her presence, her cold, suffocating presence. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, a cold, clammy sensation that made my skin crawl. I turned to face the door again, slamming my shoulder into it, but it wouldn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the door swung open and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran down the stairs, out of the hotel, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel, my mind racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still following me. When I finally got home, I tried to convince myself that it was just a bad experience, a trick of the mind. But there was something about that woman's eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, that I couldn't forget. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is too quiet, I can still hear the whispering. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I'll never forget her. And I'll never go near that hotel again.
Next story.
It was late December, and the wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows of the old house I had moved into just a few weeks prior. The storm had taken everyone by surprise. Thick snowflakes poured down in sheets, blanketing everything in a layer of cold white. I should have known better than to stay in a house that was so isolated. But the rent was cheap, and I needed a place to call my own. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard it. A soft thud from the attic above. I'd been reading a book, curled up under a thick blanket, and had almost convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old houses have a way of creaking and groaning, especially during winter. But then it came again, this time louder. A series of thumps like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, clutching the blanket tighter around me. The air in the room grew cold, and my breath turned visible in the dim light of my bedside lamp. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The attic. I knew there were no neighbors for miles, and the only way to get up there was through a narrow staircase that led to a trapdoor in the ceiling of the kitchen. I had never ventured up there. I wasn't even sure what was stored in that attic, but I had an unsettling feeling about it. I didn't want to go up there, yet something was pulling me toward it. The house had been a bargain, yes, but there was always something off about it. My first night here, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing softly in my ear. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. The floorboards creaked with phantom footsteps, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move, even when the house was perfectly still. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the overactive imagination that had been growing stronger after the loss of my family. But tonight felt different. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. The chill in the air was more intense now, the temperature noticeably dropping as I walked toward the kitchen. My feet were bare, the cold wooden floor biting at my soles. I reached for the trapdoor, my hands trembling. My heart pounded as I slowly lifted the heavy wooden door. The staircase leading up to the attic was narrow, barely wide enough for me to fit through. I glanced back at the empty kitchen, the silence almost suffocating. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself. "It's just the house." But my gut told me otherwise. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way up the stairs, the beam of light shaking in my hand. The attic was dark, darker than I'd expected. The dust in the air caught the light, swirling like tiny ghosts. The moment I stepped into the room, I noticed the old, rotting furniture, covered in thick white sheets. The smell of mildew was overpowering, and the floor was creaky beneath my feet. But there was something else in the air. Something alive. A low, rasping sound echoed in the distance, coming from the farthest corner of the attic. I froze, straining to hear. My pulse was pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" No answer. But the rasping continued, growing louder. I stepped forward cautiously, keeping my eyes on the shadows. I had to see what was making that sound. I had to know. When I reached the corner, I directed the flashlight toward the source of the noise. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the attic that was unsettling. It was what lay within it. A figure stood in the corner, hunched over and covered in tattered clothing. Its head was bowed low, and it seemed to be scratching at the floor, its hands jerking unnaturally. I could see the long, thin fingers that dug into the wood as if trying to pull something from the floorboards. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know whether to scream or run. But before I could make a move, it looked up. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were wide, hollow black voids, like two deep wells of darkness, and it smiled. The grin stretched impossibly wide, exposing rows of sharp yellow teeth. Its mouth opened wider still, revealing an abyss of blackness inside. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen in place as it lurched toward me, its twisted body creaking with every step. It was too late to escape. It was already there. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of an old chest, and fell to the floor. The thing, whatever it was, let out a low, guttural laugh. It sounded wrong, like nails scraping across glass. It reached out toward me, its fingers like claws, and I felt the air around me grow colder still. "No," I gasped, trying to push myself backward, but the walls seemed to close in around me. The thing's fingers brushed against my cheek, icy cold, sending a shiver of terror down my spine. It hissed, a sound like wind howling through a narrow canyon, and then it opened its mouth again. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned as if the very air had been stolen from me. I shut my eyes, hoping it would go away, praying that this was some twisted nightmare. But when I opened them again, it was gone. I lay there in the dark for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too exhausted to think clearly. The silence was suffocating. The cold was unbearable. My body trembled uncontrollably as I scrambled to my feet and bolted back down the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I stumbled through the kitchen and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. But the terror wasn't over. I could feel its presence, like a cold shadow that clung to my skin. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made me jump, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep. And it didn't stop. Over the next few days, I felt its presence more and more. It would brush against me when I walked through the house, a chill running down my spine as its cold fingers seemed to touch my skin. I would hear scratching noises at night, just like before, and each time I would find myself drawn to the attic. But each time I climbed those stairs, I would find it empty. No sign of the creature, just the musty old furniture and the silence. But I knew better. It was there. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and left the house, never looking back. The snowstorm had passed, but the terror lingered. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. I'll hear that low, rasping laugh in the back of my mind just before I fall asleep. And no matter where I go, I can never forget the grin of that thing, its eyes hollow and black, waiting for me.
Next story.
It was the winter of 2002 when I moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town. I had recently lost my job and was looking for a fresh start, so I found this place on a whim. The price was unbelievably low, which should have been a red flag, but I was desperate. The house was isolated, surrounded by woods, and the only thing you could hear on a quiet night was the wind rustling through the trees. It seemed like the perfect escape. The house itself was massive, a 2-story farmhouse with peeling paint and overgrown ivy crawling up the walls. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the floors creaked underfoot. The wallpaper was faded, and there were strange, old-fashioned light fixtures hanging from the ceilings. I didn't mind the wear and tear. In fact, it gave the house a certain character, a history that I was eager to uncover. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time cleaning and settling in, but it wasn't long before I started to notice the oddities. At night, the house would creak and groan, as if the walls were whispering secrets to each other. But I figured that was just the house settling. It was old, after all. What else could it be? But then the dream started. The first night it happened, I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling of unease. My bed was cold, colder than it should have been, even for winter. I glanced around the room, but everything seemed normal. I turned over to go back to sleep when I heard a whisper. "Get out." The voice was so clear, so close, that I nearly jumped out of bed. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. I shook it off as a bad dream. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I lay still, my body frozen with fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, hoping they would go away, but instead the door creaked open. My heart was in my throat as I lay there, paralyzed. The door didn't open all the way, just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the room. And through the crack, I could see something moving, shadowy figures, tall and thin, moving in the hallway. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that I was imagining it. But when I opened them again, the figures were gone. The third night was when I saw them. I had been awake for hours, trying to ignore the gnawing fear that had taken root in my chest. I finally managed to fall asleep, only to wake up again to the unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't outside my door. They were in my room. I sat up, my body trembling with fear, and there they were. 3 tall, emaciated figures standing at the foot of my bed. Their faces were twisted and hollow, as if they had been carved from wood. Their eyes were dark, lifeless voids, and their mouths were stretched into grotesque smiles that sent chills down my spine. "Leave," one of them whispered, its voice like a low growl. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if my body had turned to stone. The figures stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at me with their empty eyes. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished into the darkness. The next morning, I didn't know what to believe. Had I been dreaming? Was I just imagining things? But when I looked in the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the back of my neck, was a handprint. I could feel it, the cold, clammy touch of something that wasn't there. The same feeling I had when I saw the figures. I had to get out of that house, but something was holding me there, something I couldn't explain. I decided to do some research. I went to the local library, hoping to find something, anything that would explain what was happening. That's when I learned about the house's history. The farmhouse had been built in the early 1800s, and over the years, several families had lived there. The last family, the O'Briens, had moved in during the late 1800s. They had been a quiet, reclusive family, but then, one winter, something terrible had happened. According to the old newspaper clippings I found, the O'Brien family had disappeared without a trace. The house had been left abandoned for years, until it was eventually sold to a couple who lived there for only a short time before they, too, fled in terror. They had heard strange noises, seen shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, and found strange marks on the walls. But the most chilling part of the story was the claim that the O'Brien family had been cursed, a curse that would be passed down through the generations. I couldn't believe it. It sounded like a fairy tale, a story made up to scare children. But the more I read, the more I realized that the strange events in the house weren't random. They were part of something much darker. I went back to the farmhouse that evening, my mind spinning with what I had learned. I had to get out, but I knew the curse was real. As I walked through the front door, the air felt thick, oppressive, like it was holding its breath. The house was colder than it had ever been before. I walked through the rooms, trying to find some sense of normalcy, but all I could hear were the whispers, the voices, faint at first but growing louder, more insistent. "Leave." I turned around, and standing at the end of the hallway were the figures, the same emaciated, shadowy forms. Their eyes gleamed in the dim light, and their smiles widened into something that was no longer human. They moved toward me, and this time, I could feel their cold, clammy fingers brushing against my skin. "Get out," they whispered in unison. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran, stumbling over the old floorboards, but no matter how fast I ran, they were always just behind me, getting closer, their cold hands reaching for me. I reached the door and threw it open, the cold winter air hitting my face. But as I stepped outside, I felt it, something pulling me back, dragging me into the darkness. I fought it, struggling, but it was no use. The last thing I remember was the cold grip of the figures wrapping around me, pulling me back into the house, into their world. And then, nothing. The house still stands, abandoned, just as it has for years. No one dares to go near it. But sometimes on quiet winter nights, I hear the whispers on the wind. The voices calling out, warning others, leave.
Next story.
It was the winter of 1994, the kind of winter that made the world outside feel like a frozen wasteland. I was living alone in a small two-bedroom house near the edge of town. The house was old, an inherited property, passed down from my grandparents. It was always cozy in the winter, with the fireplace crackling and the snow piling up outside. I liked the solitude, and I had never been one to mind the isolation. That year, however, something was different. It started innocently enough, just like any other winter. The snow fell early in December, and I found myself wrapped in blankets more often than I'd care to admit, watching the snowflakes drift lazily down. But then, on the night of December 12th, something happened that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was just past midnight. I had been lying in bed listening to the wind howl outside and the occasional groan of the house as it settled. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. The sound of someone knocking at the door. I froze. Who would be out here in the middle of the night in this weather? I wasn't expecting anyone. But the knock came again, sharp and persistent. I threw on my robe and stumbled downstairs, my heart racing. When I opened the door, there was no one there. Just snow, thick, heavy snow, drifting in the wind. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it, but then I noticed something strange. There, in the snow on the porch, were footprints. Large, heavy footprints, as if someone had been standing there only moments before. I stood there for a long time, staring at the footprints, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have been out there in this storm without me hearing their footsteps. And yet, there they were, leading away from the door and into the dark woods that bordered my property. I closed the door and locked it, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was nothing, maybe some kids playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next few days were a blur. The storm continued, dumping more and more snow. I went about my daily routines, grocery shopping, cleaning, trying to keep my mind off the strange events. But then, on the night of December 16th, it happened again. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard the knock. It was the same sound, sharp and insistent, coming from the front door. I got up immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door, there was no one there again. But this time, the footprints were different. The prints weren't leading away from the house, they were leading toward it. And they weren't normal prints either. They were huge, stretching across the snow as if something large and heavy had walked right up to my door. But there were no signs of anyone, no sign of anyone leaving. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I examined the prints more closely. There was something strange about them. They were not human. The prints were too wide, too deep, as though the person, or whatever it was, had been dragging something heavy behind it. I turned and went back inside, locking the door once again. This time, I didn't try to talk myself out of it. I knew something was out there, something that wasn't right, and it was getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, listening to the silence outside, waiting for the next knock. But it never came. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. Over the next few days, I started to notice other things. The house felt different. The air was colder, even near the fire. The lights flickered at odd intervals, and sometimes, when I passed by the windows, I could have sworn I saw shadows moving just outside, just beyond the reach of the light. But the worst part came on Christmas Eve. That night, I was sitting by the fire, trying to drown out the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my bones. The storm had intensified, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves just outside the walls of the house. I heard the knock again, this time louder, more urgent. I didn't want to open the door. I knew it was a mistake, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the doorknob, and when I pulled open the door, I was met with a sight I'll never forget. There, standing on my front porch, was a figure, a tall, dark shape that seemed to absorb the light from the porch. Its face was obscured by a heavy hood, but the outlines of its features were clear enough: sunken eyes, hollow and black, and a mouth twisted into a grim, unsettling smile. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body froze, locked in place as the figure slowly reached out toward me, its hands long and clawed, its fingers twitching with a strange, unnatural energy. And then, in a voice that felt like ice in my veins, it spoke. "You're not alone." The door slammed shut on its own, and I stumbled back, falling to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling, but eventually I managed to stand up and back away from the door, my mind spinning in terror. The storm outside had reached its peak. The wind howled like a beast, and the snow was falling in thick, swirling sheets. But there was something else in the air. Something alive, something wrong. I had to get out, I had to leave. I grabbed my coat and boots, but before I could reach the door, I heard it again, the knock. But this time, it was different. The knock didn't come from the door. It came from inside the house. I slowly turned toward the sound, my heart stopping in my chest. The knock came again, but this time it was coming from the wall behind the fireplace. And then, as if in response, the fire in the hearth flickered and died. My legs gave out beneath me as I crumpled to the floor, unable to tear my eyes away from the wall. I could hear something moving behind it, something scratching, clawing at the wood. And then, in a voice that was both my own and not, I heard it speak again. "Let me in," I screamed, and the house seemed to respond, its walls groaning, its floorboards cracking. The scratching behind the wall grew louder, more frantic. And then with one final deafening crash, the wall exploded inward, and I was blinded by darkness. I woke up in a hospital a week later. The doctors said I had been found unconscious in my house, barely alive. They said there had been no sign of forced entry, and no one could explain what had happened. But I know that thing, that figure, had followed me inside. And when it spoke, when it knocked, it was not just asking for entry into my home. It was asking for entry into my soul. To this day, I can still hear the knocking.
Next story.
It was the kind of winter night that wrapped the world in silence. The kind of cold that cuts through your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, painting the world outside in a blanket of white. Inside the small cabin I rented for the weekend, the crackling fire was the only sound that kept me company. I was alone, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me, my thoughts, and a cozy fire. I'd always loved the mountains in winter. The stillness, the isolation, the way the snow muffled everything. There was something peaceful about it, as if the world itself had slowed down to a crawl. But that night, something felt different. It was the quiet. Too quiet. I had been reading a book by the fire when I first heard it, the faintest scraping sound from the kitchen. At first, I chalked it up to the wind howling against the cabin, but when the sound came again, sharper this time, my heart skipped a beat. I got up, walked cautiously to the kitchen, and flicked on the light. The room was empty, the countertops bare except for a few dirty dishes I had left earlier. I checked the windows, making sure they were closed tight. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the sense of unease didn't go away. I told myself I was being silly, that the wind had simply made the house settle. But then the scraping sound came again, closer this time, as if it were right behind me. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the kitchen. The air felt thicker now, colder somehow. I grabbed the nearest object, a large kitchen knife, and held it in my shaking hand. My breath quickened, each exhale visible in the frozen air around me. There was a knock at the door. I froze, the knife still in my hand. Who could it be? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the snowstorm had made travel almost impossible. The knocking persisted, slow and steady, as if the person outside had all the time in the world. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Should I open the door? Something told me I shouldn't, but then the knocking changed. The sound became more insistent, more frantic, as if whoever was outside was desperate. I couldn't help myself. I walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I paused for a moment, taking in a shaky breath. I told myself it was just someone lost in the storm, someone in need of help. When I opened the door, no one was there. The wind whipped through the doorway, blowing the snow into the cabin. I looked around, but the night was empty. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone nearby. The porch was vacant. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. My heart was pounding now, each beat a loud echo in my chest. I was starting to regret renting this cabin. Something wasn't right, and it had nothing to do with the storm. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The wind had likely caused the knocking, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, the scraping sound, now coming from the attic above me. I stood motionless, the knife still gripped tightly in my hand. It sounded like nails against wood, scraping in slow, deliberate motions. I knew the attic was empty. I had checked it earlier that morning when I arrived. It was just storage space. Nothing up there but old boxes and forgotten trinkets. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was up there now. My breath came faster, and I felt the cold sweat running down the back of my neck. I knew I had to investigate, but I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out of the cabin and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was making that sound. The staircase to the attic was a narrow, creaky affair, tucked behind a door at the far end of the living room. As I climbed, each step seemed to echo in the silence, as if the house itself was watching me. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and the scraping sound grew louder. It was almost like something or someone was up there, moving in the dark, dragging their fingers across the floor. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the doorknob. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the thin beam that slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. I stepped inside, my flashlight flickering as I swept it across the room. At first, there was nothing. The attic was exactly as I remembered, empty, cold, dusty. But then, in the far corner, I saw it. A figure. It was small, hunched over, its back to me. The figure was covered in tattered rags, the fabric moving as if blown by an unseen wind. It was scratching at the floor, its hands jerking in a strange, unnatural rhythm. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my blood running cold. It was like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. And then it turned. Its face was pale, the skin stretched thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them. The smile that spread across its lips was wide and twisted, its teeth jagged and yellow. I screamed, but the sound was caught in my throat. I turned and bolted toward the stairs, my legs giving out beneath me as I tripped over my own feet. I scrambled to get up, but it was too late. I felt something cold like fingers, grasping at my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked out, trying to break free, but the grip was too strong. My heart was in my throat as I screamed again, my voice breaking. I tried to pull myself free, but the thing in the attic was stronger than I could ever be. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the grip released. I fell backward, landing hard on the floor of the living room. My breath was ragged, my body shaking uncontrollably. I looked up, half expecting to see the thing standing over me, but it was gone. There was no sign of it, no evidence that it had ever been there. Just the quiet, the wind outside, and the steady crackling of the fire. But I knew what I had seen. I packed my things and left the cabin that night. The snowstorm had only worsened, but I couldn't stay there any longer. The thing in the attic, whatever it was still in my mind, lurking in the corners of my thoughts. As I drove away, the headlights cutting through the snow, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something pale with hollow eyes, standing in the window of the cabin, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories, the rumors about old houses and long-abandoned places, but I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations and fear of the unknown. It wasn't until that cold winter night that I learned just how wrong I had been. It started like any other winter evening. My wife, Claire, and I had been planning a quiet getaway to a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for a long time. We both needed a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. The idea of a cozy cabin, a fireplace, and snow-covered landscapes was just what we needed. The first evening was perfect. We arrived just as the snow began to fall, thick, heavy flakes that quickly covered the ground. The cabin was old but well-maintained, nestled deep in the woods, far away from the distractions of modern life, the kind of place you can lose yourself in. We spent the evening by the fire, enjoying each other's company, and for a while it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But that night, as the snowstorm picked up outside, something shifted. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint tapping. It was rhythmic, almost like someone knocking, but slow, deliberate. I glanced at the clock, 3:27 a.m. I wasn't sure what it was at first, maybe a tree branch brushing against the window or the wind. But then it came again. Tap, 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 closer this time. I got up, my heart beating faster than it should have been. Claire was fast asleep, and the tapping continued, growing louder. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just the house settling or the wind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the unease building inside of me. I stood by the window, staring out into the blinding white of the snowstorm. There was nothing there, just an endless wall of white, with trees bending under the weight of the snow. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. But then, just as I turned to go back to bed, the sound came again, but this time it wasn't from the window. It was coming from the door. I froze. I had locked the door when we arrived, made sure it was secure. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. Yet there it was again. The unmistakable sound of someone knocking on the door. Who could that be? I whispered to myself. There was no one else out here in the storm. We were completely isolated. Slowly, I approached the door, heart racing, my hand gripping the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I wasn't even sure why I was considering it. But I had to. I had to know who or what was out there. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. Nothing. The night air was bitterly cold, cutting through my pajamas like a knife. The snow was falling harder now, and I could barely see anything beyond the door frame. But the ground was untouched by footprints, and the wind howled through the trees, filling the silence with its mournful cry. I closed the door quickly, my heart racing. I glanced over at Claire, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of what had just happened. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Maybe I was just tired, stressed, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. Something was off. The next morning, Claire didn't seem to notice anything was amiss. We went about our day, enjoying the quiet beauty of the snow-covered landscape, walking through the woods and taking in the serene isolation of the place. But that night, when we were settling down to sleep, something changed. The atmosphere in the cabin felt different. Thick with tension, as if the air itself was heavy. That night, the tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was scratching, scraping, like something or someone was dragging something sharp across the door. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat up in bed, staring at the door, my blood running cold. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Claire. She didn't respond, didn't even stir. She was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding around her. The scratching continued, relentless, until it felt like it was right on the other side of the door, just inches from where I was lying. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and opened the door again. This time, the storm was even worse, and the darkness outside seemed to swallow everything. There were no footprints, no signs of movement. But just as I was about to close the door, I saw something. Something in the distance, standing between the trees. A figure. A person? I couldn't make out the details, but the figure was tall, thin, and completely still. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, unable to move. Then, the figure moved. Slowly at first, then with unnerving speed, it darted between the trees, vanishing into the storm. I slammed the door shut, locking it again, my hands trembling. My mind was racing. Had I really seen that? Was someone out there? I went back to the bed, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for the next sound, the next sign. But it didn't come. Instead, the silence settled in, suffocating, unbearable. The following morning, I was determined to leave. The cabin, which had once felt so cozy and inviting, now felt like a trap, a place where something was lurking just beyond the edges of reality. We packed our things quickly, Claire still unaware of what had been happening. As I was finishing loading the car, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to the door. Fresh footprints. The snow hadn't been disturbed until now. I followed them with my eyes, and they led to the front door of the cabin. But here's the thing. There were no footprints leading away. It was as if the person who had stood there, watching, had never left. I drove us out of there as fast as I could, not looking back until we reached the main road where the storm seemed to let up. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following us, watching us. That night, back in the safety of our home, I thought it was over, that whatever had haunted us in that cabin had stayed behind. But then, when I was brushing my teeth before bed, I saw it, a reflection in the mirror, a face, a pale, distorted face with hollow eyes staring at me from behind my own reflection. I turned around, but no one was there. The tapping started again, but this time it was inside my head.
Next story.
I've always believed that there are some places in this world where the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner. That's what I told myself when I first arrived at the old farmhouse. I should have known better than to take a job in the middle of nowhere, especially after hearing the rumors. I'm a freelance photographer, and I'd been hired by a family to capture their recently restored farmhouse deep in rural New York. The owners, a quiet couple named Tom and Rachel, had done a great deal of work on the house, and they wanted to document the transformation for an old family album. The job was easy enough, or at least it seemed like it at first. When I arrived, the house looked as though it had been pulled from an old storybook. An old Victorian farmhouse with an expansive porch, tall windows, and ivy crawling up the sides. But something about it didn't sit right. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive, like something was holding its breath, waiting. I set up my camera equipment in the living room and took a few shots of the antique furniture, the hardwood floors, and the high ceilings. But as I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just the isolation. I'd been in remote places before, and it wasn't uncommon to feel a little paranoid. But this was different. The hallway upstairs was dim, lit only by the thin light coming through a small window at the far end. I was setting up my tripod when I noticed it, a picture hanging crookedly on the wall, just above the staircase. It was a family portrait, black and white, faded with age. The people in the picture were standing in front of the very house I was in, but there was something about them that felt off. The woman in the portrait, who I assumed was the mother, had a cold, empty smile, her eyes too wide, too blank. I couldn't explain it, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't think much of it at first, but after a few more shots, I began hearing things. Faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind, but there was no breeze. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, tapping against the floorboards above me. I thought maybe one of the owners was upstairs, but when I called out, there was no response. As the day wore on, the strange sounds continued. I'd be adjusting my camera, and I'd hear footsteps behind me or someone breathing softly in my ear. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving across the wall in the hallway, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I wasn't alone. Around dusk, Tom and Rachel arrived home. They seemed pleasant enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Tom had this way of avoiding my eyes as if he was constantly looking over his shoulder, checking the corners of the room, and Rachel was always too quiet, like she was hiding something. I chalked it up to their obvious unease with the house, but as the night progressed, I began to understand that it was more than just nerves. As we sat down for dinner, Tom mentioned the house's history casually at first. "It's been in my family for generations," he said, "but there's something about this place, something that just doesn't feel right." Rachel didn't respond, but her fingers tapped nervously against the side of her glass. She looked out the window, her face pale as if she had seen something she didn't want to remember. "Is that why you had the house renovated?" I asked, trying to break the tension. Tom glanced at Rachel before answering. "Yeah, there were some issues with the old structure. Structural issues. But we've heard stories. People say the house is haunted." Rachel shifted in her seat, her eyes darting to the door, as if expecting someone or something to appear. I thought they were just playing it up, trying to add some excitement to an otherwise normal dinner. But when Rachel asked if I'd heard any strange sounds, I couldn't deny the truth. "I've been hearing things," I admitted. "Footsteps, whispers." Rachel stiffened. "It's the house. It's never been right." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers. They were clearer now, but still indecipherable. I could hear someone pacing back and forth in the hallway. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was in the house with me. I got up and grabbed my camera, deciding I would capture whatever was causing the noises. I walked quietly through the dark hallways, my flashlight the only source of light. The house creaked and groaned around me, but the sounds of footsteps had stopped. Instead, I heard faint scratching noises, like something was clawing at the walls. I followed the sound upstairs to the same hallway where I'd seen the crooked picture earlier. This time, the picture was gone. Instead, the wall was covered in strange markings, scratches, deep gouges, as if something had tried to claw its way out. My heart started to race. I turned to go back downstairs, but before I could take a step, I heard a loud crash behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could see the faintest outline of a figure in the hallway, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was a woman, her face obscured by long matted hair, her body cloaked in shadows. She reached out to me, her fingers elongated, twisted. Her nails were long and sharp, like claws. My blood ran cold, and I bolted downstairs, nearly tripping over the stairs in my panic. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house as fast as I could. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm not going back. I told Tom and Rachel that I couldn't finish the project. I didn't explain why. I didn't have to. They already knew. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the farmhouse still standing there, watching me. The air felt heavy, as though it was still holding its breath. And just as I was about to leave the road behind me, I glanced back. The lights in the farmhouse were on. Every single window was glowing, and I swear I saw the woman in the window staring directly at me. But when I looked again, the house was empty. Silent. Still. I haven't heard from Tom or Rachel since.
Next story.
The storm hit harder than expected. What had started as a light dusting of snow soon became a full-blown blizzard. I had planned to spend the weekend at the cabin, a small, rustic place my family owned, tucked away in the woods. The kind of place where the world felt far away, peaceful, and quiet. But peace was the last thing I would find that night. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, long after the snow had started to pile up around the narrow road that led there. The wind howled as I unloaded my bags from the car, the cold biting into my skin. The cabin looked the same as it always did, old, wooden, and covered in a thick layer of snow, but there was something off about it that day. It felt deserted, even though I was the only one there. I stepped inside, the warm air a relief after the cold. The smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax, shedding the stress of the long drive. I stoked the fire in the hearth and made myself a cup of hot tea, settling into a chair by the window to watch the storm rage outside. Hours passed, and the storm grew fiercer. The wind howled against the windows, and the snow piled higher and higher, blanketing the world in white. It was the kind of night where you could hear nothing but the storm and the crackling of the fire. As I sipped my tea, I felt it, a strange sensation at the back of my neck, as if someone were watching me. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. The cabin was empty, as it had been all day. I dismissed the feeling, telling myself I was just tired and was starting to get to me. I tried to focus on the fire, but then I heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft creaking, like footsteps on the floor above me. The cabin was small, with only 2 levels, the main floor and an attic space above. The noise came from the attic, and I instantly froze, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind making the old wooden beams creak. But then the creaking grew louder, closer. It wasn't just the house settling. Someone, or something, was up there. I put my tea down and stood, my breath catching in my throat. The cabin felt colder all of a sudden, and the sound of the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. My eyes were drawn to the attic door, which was tucked away in the corner of the living room, above the stairs. I knew I should go check it out, but part of me, most of me, wanted to just ignore it, to stay where I was and pretend nothing was wrong. But I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. The air grew colder as I approached the attic door, and the creaking noise from above became more distinct, more purposeful. Someone was moving around up there, dragging their feet across the floor. I felt a chill run through my body as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and I shone the flashlight into the darkness of the attic. The beam of light cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but piles of old furniture and boxes. It was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then I saw it. A shape, crouched in the corner of the attic, hunched over and still. It was a person, or at least it looked like a person. But there was something wrong about it. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge the light. It just sat there, its back turned to me, unmoving. I stepped forward, my pulse quickening, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of light flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the figure's head turn toward me. But when I looked again, it was still facing away. I was frozen, caught in a web of fear and curiosity. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the cabin as fast as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. I took another step forward, and the figure finally shifted, slowly, deliberately. It turned its head. The face that looked back at me was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stretch down to the sides of its face. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a rasping, gurgling breath that sent a shiver through my spine. Then it stood up. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were jerky, like something broken trying to put itself back together. The figure took a step toward me, and the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I don't know how I managed to move, but I ran. I didn't think, I didn't even look back. I just ran down the stairs, through the cabin, and out the door. The snow hit my face like needles as I stumbled through the storm, not caring where I was going, only that I needed to get away. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't feel my fingers or my toes. The wind howled around me, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, ragged and desperate. The cold seemed to seep into my very bones, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I finally collapsed in the snow, exhausted and unable to go any farther, I looked back toward the cabin. It was still there, standing alone in the storm. But the attic window, where the figure had been, was now dark. The lights inside the cabin were all out. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I know I woke up in a hospital bed the next day, with the storm long past and the world calm again. They told me I had been found hours later, unconscious in the snow. There was no sign of anyone in the cabin, no sign of the figure, nothing to explain what had happened. But I know what I saw. I know what was up there in the attic. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it.